everyone, Cleo here, and today we're going over my January wrap-up. Now, depending on when I can kind of get this video edited and all of that, there will have been a little bit of a break in my content. Won't have been too drastic, but I was away on holiday, and I've been dealing with returning back to gloomy Belgian weather after being in the beautiful Gran Canaria sunshine. So it's been a little bit of a rough start here this week, but I'm getting back into the swing of things, and so I'm filming this video right now, and hopefully I can still get this one edited before I leave for a bachelorette party this weekend. So, time to wrap up the month of January. So in the month of January, as always, I did a mid-month wrap-up, so I won't talk about those books within this video. I will just briefly mention them to get the numbers up and running. Which numbers am I talking about? At all times there will be 3 numbers on this screen. The first one will be the TBR, so the physical TBR that I am trying to reduce down to 0. At the beginning of the year, this number was at 35. Then the second number is my book buying credit system. I have made a blank slate for 2022, so we're starting at 0. Every book that I finish, every physical book that I finish is a credit that I add to that number. In contrast to 2021, I don't really have the intention to take credits away when I buy books, mainly because I'm not anticipating buying a lot of books until I get to 0 TBR. But if at any point I start to notice that things are going downhill, I might start reintroducing that sort of system again. And then the third number that is on the screen is the amount of books that I read throughout the month. So without further ado, let's just go over the books that I read in the first half of the month. So as I indicated earlier, if you want my full thoughts on these, then you can go and check out my mid-month wrap-ups. So first up, I DNF'd The Pickwick Papers by Charles Dickens. This is a physical book, longest book on my shelves, and so it earns me 1 credit. Secondly, I finished Jade City by Fonda Lee. This is a physical book off of my shelves, and so I get another credit for it. And then within the first half of the month of January, only finished one other book, which is Every Heart a Doorway by Shauna Maguire. I read this I listened to the audio, I think, for this one, and so it does not earn me a single credit. So for the remainder of the month of January, I only finished 2 more books. This is perfectly normal. I was anticipating this because, as you might know, I'm reading my TBR backwards, meaning I'm reading it from the biggest book down to the smallest book, so there will not be a whole lot of progress within the first few months of the year. So the next book that I finished actually has nothing to do with my TBR 0 project, and so also makes no impact on my TBR, and that is The Ruin of Kings by Jen Lyon. So this is a reread in April. At the end of April, the 5th and final book to this series is getting published, and so I am joining the read-along for this that is hosted by Sarah from Voyage Through Words. So every month up until the month of April, when we will be reading the newest release, we are reading a single volume within this series to kind of refresh our memory, which is definitely needed when it comes to this series. So The Ruin of Kings is the first book in A Chorus of Dragons, which is an epic fantasy series, which is a fantasy series that has a very queer, diverse cast of characters. It definitely also dives into issues of empire. And within this first book in particular, we are following our protagonist called Kieran, who is this young boy who is at the wrong place at the wrong time. He witnesses a crime being committed, and his presence there sets the ball rolling. Now, this very much is a series that has a very interesting, convoluted structure to it. So it has a multi-layer structure in which the entire book is a report that is being drafted. The report then consists of a conversation between 2 characters. These characters take turns telling their story, and in the first one in particular, they also alternate timelines. So they start the story at different points in time, meaning that for a reader it can kind of be difficult to catch up at the beginning of the story, especially since this is a type of book that kind of just throws you into the deep end, and so a lot of the world building are things that you need to kind of discover as you go through it. Aside from that, the characters and the relationship between characters become very convoluted because there is the possibility for reincarnation and the possibility for soul swapping within this story. So somebody might at some point in time have inhabited a different physical body. So things get really complicated because of that, but it also is a very fun ride because of those types of things. You know, you can kind of find that to be very off-putting, both because of its complexity and also because of that sort of feeling that anything goes, anything is possible. Or you can kind of go along with the ride and really enjoy that sort of fast-paced plots that develops as a result of that. Throughout the series, I do find that there are very unique and refreshing storylines or character arcs that are being described. Within this first one, for example, we definitely have a scene that very much discusses the topic of consent, which is something that you don't really find that often within epic high fantasy, for example. Now, as you'll see, I heavily tabbed this one. For me, this is a reread. The tabbing doesn't necessarily refer to like great lines or something like that. There definitely are tabs for those types of things. They're mainly elements that have an important role for the overarching storyline. So I tabbed references to dragons within this one, for example, to gods and goddesses, to the particular story arcs of our main characters, for example. And then, of course, I tabbed all of those things that I was referring to, that soul swapping, that reincarnation, and all of those things, to be able to help myself out when I'm getting confused again. And then the final book that I read in the month of January is a very different one, very different tone, very different type of genre. This is a historical fiction, and it is Beijing Coma by Ma Tian. So this is a banned book in China. The author himself is banned as well. And this is a book that talks about the Tiananmen protest of 1988. Now, this book sets off quite convoluted, and it was difficult to get into this book at first. So for those of you who don't know about the Tiananmen protests, so Tiananmen protests were basically a series of student protests that took place over a week or maybe multiple weeks of time. In that period of time, Chinese students took over Tiananmen Square, and they had hunger strikes, for example, and things like that, until the point in which the Chinese government sent in the army to clear out the square. How many people were hurt within the conflict, how many people were killed, these numbers are not really available to us, and Tiananmen is an event that China is trying to erase from its history. And so, because of that, this book is banned. Ma Tian is an author that I hadn't read before, but based on what I read about his other books or about the subject matter of his other books, he does not shy away from topics that the Chinese government doesn't like to address. For example, the novel or the short story collection that is mentioned within the contents of this book, Stick Out Your Tongue, talks about Tibet, for example, which is another topic that Chinese government doesn't like to talk about. So you can imagine that this is going to be quite a heavy read, and it definitely was the case. I will say it was not a very emotional read for me. I didn't really get emotionally attached to these characters, for example, but I did definitely have quite not necessarily a super emotional response, but it definitely impacted me a lot to read about these events more thoroughly. Up until this point, I didn't really know too much about what had taken place throughout those weeks, and the book also dives into a lot more than just what happens in Tiananmen itself. Because in Beijing Coma, we start off the story from the perspective of our protagonist, who is in a coma. So he was shot during the protests at Tiananmen, and he fell into a coma as a result. And so at the beginning of this book, he's kind of awakening, or his consciousness is awakening. He remains a plant, as they refer to him, throughout the rest of the book. He does not wake up, but his consciousness does become more and more active, does become more and more aware of what is happening around him. And so we get the story of what is happening around him and the way that his mother, who is a widow at that point in time, how his mother needs to take care of him on her own while having to deal with the stigma surrounding these events. And so she also has to constantly hide how her son landed in a coma in order to be able to get the care that she needs. Every year she is also visited by the police. She's taken away from Beijing in order to avoid her being a sort of like figurehead for a movement to protest what has taken place in Tiananmen. And so this present day storyline is interlaced with his memories of what came before. And we originally start his memories way before Tiananmen, from his early childhood, from his first memories of being born in a hospital corridor, through the memories that he has of his childhood and of his father who had been sent to a work camp because he was an intellectual in the time of the Cultural Revolution, through his days at university, his exploration of love, of relationships at university, into the time in which the Tiananmen protests are taking place and which he is part of the student organization there. I will definitely say that the pace for me went up a whole lot once we started to get to the Tiananmen protests themselves, once we started to deal with the student movement and to see those gears shift. Then I really started to get more and more involved within the story. But I definitely understand why the previous section was included. And I did definitely feel that the memories that he had about his father and about what his father went through during the Cultural Revolution were also very impactful, very important. Also a side of things taking place in the Cultural Revolution that I didn't really know too much about. And, you know, that were pretty damn atrocious. So there are definitely a whole lot of crimes against humanity that you will read about within this book, not just the Tiananmen protests themselves, definitely about the events taking place during the Cultural Revolution itself. And there are definitely also these incidences of, you know, the atmosphere that this regime created, the atmosphere in which you have to hide certain things that are taking place from your neighbors, or otherwise your neighbors are going to tell on you. You need to sort of like actively endorse the party's opinions. You need to make it known that you are a party person through and through, that you absolutely stand by all of their ideals and that there is no flaw within the system, to avoid people ratting you out to the local police, local governments, and things like that. When it comes to the Tiananmen protest itself, it's also very interesting because this book very much dives into the chaos of the chaos of those protests, the lack of organization. These are student protests. These are students who decided to go to that square because of the death of one of their leaders, one of their professors, who was somebody who was arguing for more democracy. This person had kind of lost some reputation recently. The book will go into that, and they want to see him reinstated, more or less. And so this protest starts in a moment of passion, and as time goes on, they try to organize these protests, but they are still students. They are still just making decisions on the moment. They don't really have any experiences in leadership. And so you kind of see how they're also constantly creating new organizations, deposing old ones, the leadership roles constantly shift and things like that. So there's a whole lot of internal politics within the square itself, within the student movements themselves. And there's just a whole lot of interesting things going into that period of time. Aside of the internal squabbles, they need to be on the lookout of secret police members because the Chinese government will have infiltrated the square with secret agents. And so, yeah, I thought this one was a fascinating read. I did think it was a little bit on the long side. I did struggle in parts with it. As I said, in the beginning it was difficult for me because I found that beginning to be quite confusing. It's potentially done intentionally because his consciousness isn't as sharp yet at that point in the book, and so the lines between what is present and what are his memories are more blurred. But that also made it difficult for me to follow along in the beginning, and so it definitely took me a while to be able to fully appreciate this read, but I learned a lot and I definitely did find it a fascinating read, and I will definitely be picking up more Matien in the future. This is a book off of my physical TBR, so it's also counting for credits, and it does mean that I'm ending this month with a TBR of 31. So a reduction of 4 books is not a reduction that I need in order to get to 0 before the month of July, but I mean, as I said, we're going from the biggest book down to the shortest book. It was always going to happen that the first few months are going to be less productive. I'm just hopeful that I still managed to do just about enough. It was only 3 books. I'm hoping to do better in the month of February, and then even better in the month of March, and so on and so forth. And so let's not give up hope yet. We'll see where we end up going in the next few months. But I'm still hopeful that I can do it within the first 6 months. But so yeah, ending this month on 31, which means that in February I will be going under 30, which is a very exciting moment as well. So looking forward to that. Hope you guys enjoyed this video, and see you guys for the next one. Bye!